The Merovingian Code, the bloodline before the Templars, the mystery that rewrote European history. What if I told you that the most powerful secret in medieval Europe wasn't hidden in a vault, wasn't written in ancient texts, and wasn't guarded by knights or monks? What if the key to understanding how Christianity conquered the barbarian world, how the Holy Roman Empire was born, and why the Vatican still exists today, was literally growing out of people's heads? Here's a puzzle for you. In 754 CE, Pope Stephen II traveled hundreds of dangerous miles across the Alps, risking bandits, wolves, and political assassination, just to perform a single ceremony. Not a coronation, not a wedding, not even a funeral. He came to cut someone's hair. And that haircut changed the course of Western civilization forever. But here's where it gets weird. The man whose hair was cut, he wasn't even a king yet. The man who ordered it, he was already the most powerful person in Europe, but technically just a glorified servant. And the dynasty that lost everything because of this haircut, they've been ruling for over 300 years, claiming their power came directly from God himself. So what made this haircut so earth-shatteringly important that it ended one royal bloodline forever and created another that would rule for centuries? Why were medieval kings so terrified of scissors that they'd rather die than get a trim? And how did something as simple as hair length become the difference between divine right and political extinction? Grab a comfortable seat, maybe dim those lights, and prepare yourself for the most bizarre power struggle in European history. Because we're about to uncover the Merovingian Code, the secret that lay hidden in plain sight for over 1,000 years, written not in books or carved in stone, but woven into the very DNA of royal power itself. The answer will make you question everything you thought you knew about how kingdoms rise and fall. The sacred hair of Childeric. When a king's power lived in his locks, the mane of authority, you're about to discover why a barbarian king's hair care routine nearly toppled the foundations of Western civilization. Picture this. It's 457 CE, and you're standing in the muddy courtyard of a Frankish stronghold somewhere in what will one day become northern France. The air reeks of unwashed bodies, fermenting ale, and the peculiar mixture of leather, iron, and desperation that clings to warrior societies teetering on the edge of collapse. You watch as a young man named Childeric, barely 20 years old, approaches a circle of grizzled tribal elders who will decide his fate. But here's the kicker. They're not examining his sword skills, his battle scars, or even his ability to inspire loyalty among his warriors. No, these weathered old men are carefully inspecting his hair. And I mean carefully. They're running their fingers through his locks like a modern sommelier examining a vintage wine, checking the thickness, the length, the way it catches the firelight. Because in the strange world of Merovingian politics, a king without proper hair was like a smartphone without a battery, technically still functional, but utterly useless for its intended purpose. See, the Merovingians didn't just believe their kings were chosen by God. They believed God's divine power literally flowed through their hair. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They genuinely thought that cutting a Merovingian king's hair would drain his supernatural abilities like unplugging a lamp from the wall. It sounds ridiculous until you realize this belief system lasted for over 3 centuries and shaped the entire political landscape of early medieval Europe. Childeric stood there, his blonde hair flowing past his shoulders in the traditional style, knowing that every strand on his head represented a thread of political legitimacy. The elders were looking for signs. Was his hair thick enough to channel divine authority? Long enough to demonstrate his royal bloodline? Healthy enough to suggest God's continued favor? You have to understand the world Childeric was inheriting. The Roman Empire was collapsing faster than a house of cards in an earthquake. Germanic tribes were carving up former Roman territories like teenagers dividing up pizza slices. The old certainties, Roman law, Roman roads, Roman taxes, were crumbling into dust. In this chaos, people desperately needed something to believe in, some sign that their leaders possessed supernatural authority to restore order. The Franks, like many Germanic peoples, found that authority in hair. It wasn't just vanity or fashion. Hair represented continuity, strength, and divine connection in ways that crowns or scepters never could. Crowns could be stolen, after all. Scepters could be broken. But hair? Hair grew from within, marking someone as genuinely chosen rather than merely appointed. Plus, unlike other symbols of power, hair couldn't be faked. You either had the bloodline hair or you didn't. Childeric's hair examination wasn't just a coronation ceremony. It was a supernatural DNA test conducted in front of witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives swearing they'd seen proof of his divine right to rule. The elders nodded their approval. His hair met the mystical requirements. But becoming king meant more than just having good hair. It meant understanding that your hair was now the most valuable political asset in your kingdom. More valuable than gold, more important than armies, more crucial than alliances. Because the moment you lost your hair, you lost everything. Childeric would spend the next 30 years carefully maintaining his locks, knowing that every morning when he woke up, he was literally wearing his crown. His barbers weren't servants. They were the guardians of political stability. His hair care routine wasn't personal grooming, it was statecraft. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Childeric's obsession with his hair wasn't just personal paranoia. It was completely justified, because across Europe, rival claimants to various thrones were already sharpening their scissors, planning the day they could forcibly cut his hair and render him powerless. Medieval politics wasn't just about military conquest, it was about follicle warfare. But what Childeric didn't know, as he accepted the tribal crown that day, was that his hair-based authority would eventually create a problem that would echo through European history for the next 1,000 years. A problem so fundamental that it would require Pope Stephen II to trek across the Alps 3 centuries later with a very sharp pair of shears. Because when your entire political system is built on the sanctity of never cutting the king's hair, what happens when you need to replace a dynasty that's become completely useless but still has great hair? The bloodline burdened 30 years later. You're standing in Childeric's royal hall, watching the most powerful man in Europe die for what appears to be a particularly aggressive case of medieval food poisoning. The year is 481 CE, and Childeric's son Clovis is about to inherit not just a kingdom, but a supernatural hair care regimen that will determine the fate of Western Christianity. But first, let's talk about what Childeric accomplished with his divinely blessed locks. Turn out, having God-powered hair was actually pretty effective for medieval politics. Childeric spent 3 decades expanding Frankish territory, not through brilliant military strategy or diplomatic genius, but because enemy tribes genuinely believed his hair gave him supernatural advantages in battle. His reputation grew with his hair length. By the time his locks reached his waist, neighboring kings were surrendering without fighting, convinced that opposing someone with that much divine hair was basically suicide. Childeric's hair-based authority system worked so well that it created the most stable barbarian kingdom in post-Roman Europe. While other Germanic tribes were still fighting endless civil wars over succession disputes, the Franks enjoyed unprecedented political continuity. Why? Because everyone agreed that the person with the longest, most magnificent hair was obviously chosen by God to rule. It was medieval politics at its most elegantly simple. No complicated election systems, no debates over political philosophy, no messy power struggles between rival nobles. Just look at the hair, pick the best hair, follow the hair. Democracy, for people who believe democracy, was a Roman perversion that had obviously failed. But here's where Childeric's system created an unexpected problem. By the time young Clovis inherited his father's throne and his father's supernatural hair, the Merovingian dynasty had become so successful that they were running out of things to conquer. Clovis looked around his kingdom and realized he'd inherited a political machine designed for expansion. But there wasn't much left to expand into. Well, except for one rather large obstacle. The majority of his subjects were still pagan, while the civilized world was rapidly converting to Christianity. You see, Clovis found himself caught in medieval Europe's ultimate identity crisis. His hair gave him authority over pagan Franks who believed in the old Germanic gods. But if he wanted to rule over the former Roman territories his father had conquered, territories filled with Christian subjects who paid better taxes and built more impressive cities, he needed to somehow convince them that his pagan hair was actually blessed by the Christian God. This was like trying to convince people that your lucky rabbit's foot was actually blessed by the Pope. Technically possible, but requiring some serious theological gymnastics. Clovis spent his early years as king trying to solve this puzzle. How do you maintain a power system based on pagan hair magic, while appealing to Christian subjects who think hair magic is demonic witchcraft? How do you keep your barbarian warriors happy, while also convincing Roman bishops that you're a legitimate Christian ruler? The answer, as it turned out, involved one of the most audacious religious rebranding campaigns in European history. In 496 CE, Clovis was losing a crucial battle against the Alemanni tribe. His forces were scattered, his best warriors were dead, and defeat seemed inevitable. According to later Christian chroniclers, Clovis looked up at his failing army and made a desperate bargain with his wife's God. Jesus Christ, if you give me victory in this battle, I'll convert to Christianity and bring my entire kingdom with me. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. Christian sources claim Jesus immediately intervened, turning the tide of battle and giving Clovis miraculous victory. Pagan sources suggest Clovis simply got lucky when the Alemanni king was killed by a random arrow, causing their forces to retreat in confusion. But here's what really mattered. Clovis won the battle, and he had to decide whether to honor his supposed bargain with the Christian God. Now, you might think this would create a hair crisis. After all, Clovis's entire authority was based on the belief that his pagan hair contained divine power. If he converted to Christianity, wouldn't that invalidate his hair-based legitimacy? Clovis came up with a solution that was either brilliant or completely insane, depending on your perspective on medieval theology. He decided that his hair had always been blessed by the Christian God. The Franks had just been confused about which god was doing the blessing. His supernatural locks weren't pagan magic. They were Christian miracles that predated his formal conversion. It was the ultimate religious retcon. Clovis essentially claimed that Jesus had been secretly blessing Merovingian hair for generations, and the family's conversion to Christianity was simply them finally acknowledging what had been true all along. The genius of this approach was that it allowed Clovis to keep his hair-based authority while gaining legitimacy with Christian subjects. Pagan Franks could still believe in the magic hair. They just had to accept that the magic was coming from Jesus instead of Odin. Christian Romans could accept Clovis as a legitimate ruler. They just had to believe that God worked through divinely blessed royal hair. On Christmas Day, 508 CE, Clovis was baptized in the Cathedral of Reims by Bishop Remigius. But here's the crucial detail that most history books gloss over. Clovis insisted on keeping his hair completely intact during the baptism ceremony. Most Christian converts had their heads shaved as a symbol of rebirth and rejection of their pagan past. Clovis refused. His hair was staying exactly as it was, just now with Christian blessing instead of Germanic magic. Bishop Remigius, practical politician that he was, agreed to this arrangement. After all, Clovis was offering to convert an entire barbarian kingdom to Christianity. If the price was allowing the king to keep his supernatural hair, that seemed like a reasonable compromise. But what neither Clovis nor Bishop Remigius fully understood was that they were creating a theological time bomb that would eventually explode 3 centuries later. Because once you establish that Christian kings could derive their authority from divinely blessed hair, what happens when those kings become completely incompetent but still have great hair? What happens when the real power in the kingdom is being wielded by someone who doesn't have a sacred hair? Someone who's actually competent at governing, but can never officially become king, because his hair doesn't have the right magical properties. Clovis had solved his immediate political problem, but he created a much larger structural issue that would eventually require papal intervention and a very dramatic haircut to resolve. The long-haired Shadow Kings fast forward to 743 CE, and you're witnessing one of the most bizarre political situations in European history. You're standing in the palace of the Frankish king Childeric III, watching the daily spectacle of medieval puppet government in action. King Childeric sits on his throne, resplendent in his floor-length hair that hasn't been cut since birth. His locks are so long they require a special servant whose only job is to arrange them properly for royal audiences. He looks magnificent, divine, chosen by God himself to rule over the greatest Christian kingdom in Europe. There's just one small problem. King Childeric is completely, utterly, spectacularly useless. He can't read. He can't write. He can barely speak coherently during royal councils. His idea of political strategy is nodding along with whatever his advisors tell him. He's never won a battle, never passed a law, never made a diplomatic alliance, never done anything that resembles actual governing. But his hair is absolutely perfect. Meanwhile, standing behind the throne is a man named Pepin the Short. Pepin is brilliant, politically savvy, militarily competent, and arguably the most powerful person in Europe. He controls the army, manages the economy, conducts diplomacy, and makes every important decision in the kingdom. He's the king in all but name. Except for one crucial detail. Pepin's hair is disappointingly ordinary. No matter how competent he proves himself, no matter how many victories he wins or how skillfully he governs, he can never officially become king because he lacks the supernatural Merovingian hair. This is the logical endpoint of Clovis's hair-based political system. After 2.5 centuries, the Merovingian dynasty had bred itself into a collection of long-haired incompetents who possessed divine right, but zero practical ability. Meanwhile, the real governing was being done by a family of mayors of the palace, technically servants, but actually the power behind the throne. The situation had become so absurd that foreign diplomats visiting the Frankish court couldn't tell who was actually in charge. They'd arrive expecting to negotiate with King Childeric, only to discover that all real decisions were made by his mayor, Pepin. It was like trying to conduct business with a corporation where the CEO was a decorative figurehead and all actual authority rested with someone whose official title was assistant to the regional manager. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Pepin the Short was getting tired of ruling from the shadows. For decades, the mayor family, later known as the Carolingians, had been doing all the work while the Merovingians received all the credit. Pepin's father, Charles Martel, had literally saved Christian Europe from Muslim conquest at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE, but King Thierry IV got credit for the victory because he had the sacred hair. Pepin himself had spent years expanding Frankish territory, reforming the legal system, and strengthening ties with the church, but all his achievements were officially attributed to whatever long-haired Merovingian happened to be sitting on the throne. The political situation was becoming unsustainable. The Franks had real enemies: Muslim armies in Spain, pagan tribes in Germany, Byzantine emperors plotting to reclaim former Roman territories. They needed effective leadership, not a hair-blessed puppet show. But the Merovingian hair mystique was so deeply embedded in Frankish political culture that removing it seemed impossible. Pepin faced a seemingly unsolvable problem. How do you replace a divinely appointed dynasty without destroying the entire basis of royal authority? If Pepin simply murdered Childeric III and seized the throne, he'd be just another usurper. Without the sacred hair, his rule would lack legitimacy, and rival nobles could challenge him on religious grounds. But Pepin was nothing if not politically creative. In 750 CE, he came up with a solution that was either brilliant or sacrilegious, depending on your perspective on medieval theology. Instead of trying to replace Merovingian divine right, Pepin decided to transfer it. He sent envoys to Rome with a carefully worded question for Pope Zachary. Holy Father, who should truly be called king? The person who has royal title but no royal power, or the person who has royal power but no royal title? Pope Zachary, who had his own political reasons for supporting the Carolingians, gave Pepin exactly the answer he was hoping for. It is better that he who has the power should be called king rather than he who remains without royal power. With papal backing secured, Pepin moved to the final phase of his plan. In 751 CE, he arranged for a special ceremony that would fundamentally alter the nature of European kingship forever. The ceremony took place in the monastery of Saint Denis, just outside Paris. King Childeric III was brought to the monastery under the pretense of a routine royal visit. Pepin was there, along with a carefully selected group of Frankish nobles and church officials. And most importantly, Pope Zachary's representative was present with a very special tool, a pair of blessed scissors. What happened next was the most dramatic haircut in European history. In front of witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives swearing to what they'd seen, Childeric III's sacred hair was cut. Not trimmed, not styled, completely shorn off, reducing the last Merovingian king to a bald, powerless, ordinary mortal. But the ceremony didn't stop there. Immediately after Childeric's hair was removed, Pepin the Short was anointed with sacred oil in the first royal coronation ceremony in Frankish history. The Pope's representative declared that God had transferred his divine blessing from the Merovingian bloodline to Pepin's family through the sacred ritual of anointing. It was the ultimate political magic trick. In a single ceremony, Pepin had destroyed 3 centuries of hair-based royal legitimacy and replaced it with a new system of church-sanctioned divine right. The age of supernatural hair was over. The age of papal king-making had begun. Childeric III, now completely bald and politically neutered, was shipped off to a monastery where he spent the rest of his life as a monk. The Merovingian dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, vanished overnight. And Pepin? Pepin became King Pepin I, founder of the Carolingian dynasty that would produce Charlemagne and shape European politics for centuries to come. But here's the most fascinating part of this story. The haircut that ended Merovingian rule also fundamentally changed the relationship between church and state in medieval Europe. By seeking papal approval for his coup, Pepin established the principle that the Pope had the authority to make and unmake kings. This precedent would echo through European politics for the next 1,000 years, influencing everything from the investiture crisis to the Protestant Reformation. Clovis and the vase of Soissons, the divine right born from petty theft, the sacred smash and grab you wake up in 486 CE to the sound of screaming and the smell of smoke. Your city, Soissons, is being sacked by a barbarian army led by a 20-year-old king whose divine hair is supposedly blessed by Jesus Christ himself. You're about to witness how a simple dispute over stolen church property created the theological foundation for absolute monarchy in Europe. But first, let me set the scene for what might be the most important temper tantrum in Western history. King Clovis and his Frankish warriors have just finished conquering the last major Roman stronghold in Gaul. The battle was brutal but decisive. The Roman general Syagrius fled so fast he practically left skid marks on the battlefield. Now comes the fun part, dividing up the loot. Picture this. Hundreds of bloodthirsty Frankish warriors standing around enormous piles of stolen treasure. Gold coins, silver chalices, precious manuscripts, ornate weapons, and religious artifacts worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. The air is thick with excitement and barely contained greed. These men have just risked their lives in battle, and now it's time for their reward. But here's where things get complicated. Among all this stolen wealth sits one particular item that's causing political headaches: an ornate silver vase that was looted from the Cathedral of Soissons. Now you might think, what's the big deal? It's just one vase among thousands of stolen items. But this wasn't just any vase. This was a sacred vessel used in Christian religious ceremonies, and Bishop Remigius, the most influential church leader in the region and Clovis's key political ally, wanted it back. See, Clovis was still navigating the tricky transition from pagan barbarian king to Christian ruler of a mixed population. He needed the church's support to legitimize his rule over former Roman territories filled with Christian subjects. Bishop Remigius had been crucial in facilitating Clovis's conversion and helping him rebrand his supernatural hair as a Christian miracle rather than pagan magic. So when Bishop Remigius politely requested the return of the stolen vase, Clovis saw an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to Christian values while strengthening his alliance with the church. Simple diplomatic courtesy, right? Wrong. Because Clovis had forgotten one crucial detail about early medieval politics. Barbarian armies were not modern military organizations with clear chains of command. They were essentially armed gangs held together by traditions of shared plunder and mutual respect. And those traditions did not include kings arbitrarily deciding how loot should be distributed. Frankish custom was crystal clear. After a successful battle, all captured wealth was pooled together and divided according to strict rules. Each warrior received a share based on his rank, his performance in battle, and the value of his equipment. The king got a larger share, but he couldn't simply claim specific items for himself without going through the proper distribution process. Clovis was about to learn that becoming a Christian king didn't automatically give him the authority to override barbarian military traditions that his warriors considered sacred. He approached the assembled army with confidence, pointing to the ornate vase and explaining that he wanted to return it to the church as a gesture of Christian piety. He probably expected his men to nod approvingly and praise their king's religious devotion. Instead, he got the medieval equivalent of a union grievance. A warrior, let's call him Frank because that's probably what his name actually was, stepped forward and challenged Clovis directly. "You shall receive nothing from this loot except what the lot fairly assigns to you," Frank declared, raising his battle axe for emphasis. Now, this might seem like simple insubordination, but Frank was actually upholding a fundamental principle of barbarian military culture. Warriors followed their kings into battle with the understanding that loot would be distributed fairly according to established customs. If kings could arbitrarily claim whatever they wanted, the entire system of military loyalty would collapse. Frank's challenge wasn't treason, it was quality control. But Clovis, standing there with his divinely blessed hair flowing in the breeze, was not in the mood for a civics lesson about barbarian democracy. He was a king chosen by God, blessed with supernatural authority, and allied with the most powerful religious institution in the known world. Some random warrior with an attitude problem was not going to lecture him about proper loot distribution. What happened next would echo through European political theory for the next 1,000 years. Clovis looked at Frank, looked at the vase, looked at the hundreds of warriors watching this confrontation, and made a decision that revealed something fundamental about his understanding of royal authority. Instead of respecting barbarian tradition or attempting to negotiate a compromise, he chose to assert his divine right as king. He walked over to the vase, picked it up, and smashed it over Frank's head. Okay, that's not exactly what happened. Clovis actually smashed the vase with his battle axe while shouting, "Thus shall it be done to you if you do not obey me." Frank, presumably seeing that discretion was the better part of valor when facing a king with a weapon and a serious anger management problem, backed down. Clovis gathered up the pieces of the vase, had them melted down and reforged, and presented the restored vessel to Bishop Remigius as planned. Problem solved, right? Not quite. Because what Clovis had actually done was establish a precedent that would fundamentally alter the nature of kingship in medieval Europe. The theology of royal rage 1 year later. You're standing in a field watching Clovis conduct his annual military review, a ceremony where the king inspects his warriors' weapons and equipment to ensure army readiness. It's 487 CE. And this routine inspection is about to become one of the most psychologically disturbing displays of royal authority in medieval history. See, Clovis hadn't forgotten about Frank's challenge to his authority. For an entire year, he'd been thinking about that moment when a common warrior dared to question his divine right to distribute loot as he saw fit. And Clovis had come to a conclusion that would have made Machiavelli proud. Sometimes a king needs to make an example that ensures no one ever questions his authority again. Frank was there in the ranks, probably assuming that the vase incident was ancient history. After all, a year had passed, Clovis had gotten his way, the church was happy, and everyone had moved on to other concerns. Frank had likely convinced himself that his moment of defiance was forgotten. He was tragically wrong. Clovis approached Frank during the inspection and began examining his weapons with unusual attention. He picked up Frank's battle axe, the same axe Frank had raised while challenging royal authority, and declared it insufficiently maintained. "Your weapons are poorly kept," Clovis announced loud enough for nearby warriors to hear. "Your axe is dull, your spear is damaged. You're not properly equipped for military service." Frank probably started to protest that his weapons were perfectly functional, but before he could speak, Clovis continued, "This axe is so poorly maintained it's dangerous to the army's effectiveness." And then, with deliberate theatrical timing, Clovis raised Frank's own axe and brought it down on Frank's skull, killing him instantly. "Thus you did last year at Soissons to the vase," Clovis declared to Frank's corpse, making sure everyone present understood that this wasn't a random execution, but calculated royal justice. Now, you might be thinking, that seems like a massive overreaction to a minor disagreement about loot distribution. And you'd be right. Clovis had just committed murder over what amounted to a procedural dispute. But from Clovis's perspective, Frank's challenge hadn't been about a vase. It had been about the fundamental nature of royal authority. You see, Clovis was operating under a completely different understanding of kingship than his barbarian warriors. Traditional Germanic tribes chose their kings through consensus and expected those kings to govern according to established customs and traditions. Kings were first among equals, more powerful than other warriors, but still bound by the same rules that governed everyone else. But Clovis had absorbed something different from his interactions with Christian theology and Roman political theory. He developed a concept of absolute royal authority that derived directly from divine blessing. In his mind, questioning the king's decisions wasn't just political disagreement. It was literally challenging God's chosen representative on earth. Frank's execution wasn't murder, it was religious enforcement. The warriors watching this display got the message immediately. Their king wasn't just claiming the right to distribute loot as he saw fit. He was claiming the right to kill anyone who questioned that right. The age of barbarian democracy was over. The age of absolute monarchy had begun. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Clovis didn't keep his new understanding of royal authority to himself. He began articulating a political theory that would become the foundation of European kingship for the next 1,000 years. According to Clovis's emerging ideology, kings weren't just military leaders chosen by their followers. They were divine representatives appointed by God himself to rule over Christian people. This authority came not from popular consent or tribal tradition, but directly from heaven through the medium of sacred royal bloodline, symbolized, of course, by the supernaturally blessed Merovingian hair. If God had chosen the king, then opposing the king was tantamount to opposing God. And if opposing the king was opposing God, then kings had not just the right, but the religious obligation to punish such opposition as severely as possible. It was a brilliant piece of theological politics. By framing royal authority in religious terms, Clovis had found a way to override every traditional limitation on kingly power. Tribal customs? God's authority superseded human traditions. Warrior privileges? God's chosen king decided what privileges people deserved. Democratic consensus? God had already made his choice by blessing the royal bloodline. Clovis spent the rest of his reign systematically implementing this new theory of absolute monarchy. He eliminated rival Frankish kings who claimed equal authority, not through normal political competition, but through what he characterized as religious warfare against false claimants to divine authority. When he defeated King Sigebert of the Ripuarian Franks, Clovis didn't just claim Sigebert's territory. He declared that God had revealed Sigebert to be an illegitimate usurper whose defeat proved his lack of divine blessing. When he eliminated King Ragnar of Cambrai, Clovis characterized it not as political assassination, but as divine justice against someone who had falsely claimed royal authority. By the time of Clovis's death in 511 CE, he had completely transformed the nature of Frankish kingship. What had been a tribal confederation led by elected war chiefs had become an absolute monarchy justified by Christian theology and enforced through spectacular violence. But Clovis's most important innovation wasn't his use of religious authority to justify political power. It was his understanding that royal authority needed to be performed, not just exercised. The performance of divine right. You're now witnessing the funeral of King Clovis in 511 CE, and what you're seeing is the most elaborate piece of political theater in barbarian history. This isn't just a burial ceremony. It's a carefully choreographed demonstration designed to establish that Clovis's understanding of absolute royal authority will outlive him and transfer seamlessly to his heirs. But first, let's understand what Clovis had accomplished in the 25 years since the vase incident at Soissons. Through a combination of military conquest, political assassination, and theological innovation, Clovis had created something entirely new in European history. A barbarian kingdom that claimed the same absolute authority as the old Roman emperors, but justified that authority through Christian theology rather than pagan imperial tradition. When Clovis died, he controlled territory from the Rhine River to the Pyrenees Mountains, essentially all of modern France and significant portions of Germany and Spain. But more importantly, he had established a system of government that would serve as the template for European monarchy for the next 1,000 years. The funeral ceremony was designed to demonstrate three crucial points about Clovis's legacy. First, that his royal authority had been genuinely divine rather than merely human. Second, that this divine authority could transfer through bloodline inheritance to his sons. And third, that anyone questioning this inherited authority would face the same fate as Frank at Soissons. The ceremony began with Clovis's body being displayed in the Cathedral of Paris, dressed in royal regalia and surrounded by religious symbols that emphasized his role as God's chosen representative. Bishop Remigius, the same bishop who had received the restored vase, presided over funeral rites that explicitly connected Clovis's kingship to biblical models of divinely appointed rulers. But the real political message came during the inheritance ceremony. Clovis's four sons, Theoderic, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar, each received equal shares of their father's kingdom along with identical copies of his royal regalia. Each son's heir was formally blessed by church officials, establishing that the divine authority previously concentrated in Clovis had now been distributed among legitimate heirs. This wasn't just practical politics, it was theological innovation. Clovis's funeral established the principle that divine right could be inherited, divided, and recombined while maintaining its essential character. Royal authority wasn't personal to individual kings. It was a supernatural property of the entire Merovingian bloodline. The implications of this innovation were staggering. If divine authority resided in the bloodline rather than in individual rulers, then every member of the royal family possessed some degree of supernatural legitimacy. This meant that Merovingian kings could delegate authority to relatives, form alliances between related kingdoms, and even recover from temporary defeats without losing their fundamental claim to divine right. But it also meant that the Merovingian system contained the seeds of its own eventual destruction. See, by establishing that divine authority resided in bloodline rather than competence, Clovis had created a political system that could theoretically continue forever regardless of individual kings' abilities. As long as the royal family continued to exist and maintain the sacred hair that symbolized their divine connection, their right to rule could never be legitimately challenged. This system worked brilliantly for the next 2 centuries. Merovingian kings conquered territory, established laws, built alliances, and maintained political stability throughout the early medieval period. The combination of inherited divine right and performed royal authority created one of the most successful political systems in European history. But there was one crucial flaw in Clovis's design. It made no provision for what to do if the royal bloodline became completely incompetent while retaining perfect divine credentials. Remember our friend Childeric III from the earlier story? The long-haired puppet king who couldn't read, write, or govern, but possessed impeccable supernatural authority. He was the logical endpoint of Clovis's system, a ruler who embodied everything Clovis had claimed was necessary for legitimate kingship, but who lacked every practical skill needed for effective government. The Vase of Soissons incident had established that royal authority derived from divine appointment rather than popular consent or practical competence. Frank's execution had demonstrated that this authority could be enforced through spectacular violence. Clovis's funeral had proven that such authority could be inherited through bloodline succession. But what Clovis never anticipated was that his descendants would eventually become so politically useless that effective governing would have to be delegated to non-royal administrators. Administrators who possessed all the practical skills necessary for kingship, but lacked the supernatural hair that Clovis had made essential for legitimate authority. The Carolingian Revolution of 751 CE wasn't just a dynastic change. It was the final resolution of a contradiction that Clovis had built into European monarchy at Soissons in 486 CE. When Pepin the Shortcut Childeric III's hair and claimed the throne with papal blessing, he was essentially arguing that practical competence should override inherited divine right, the exact opposite of the principle Clovis had established when he smashed that vase over Frank's head. But here's the fascinating irony. Pepin couldn't simply reject Clovis's theory of divine royal authority because that theory had become too deeply embedded in European political culture. Instead, he had to find a new source of divine legitimacy, papal anointing, to replace the old source of Merovingian bloodline blessing. The Vase of Soissons had established that kings ruled by divine right rather than popular consent. The haircut at St. Denis confirmed that principle while changing the mechanism through which divine right was transmitted. European monarchy would continue to claim supernatural authority for another 1,000 years. It just wouldn't be coming from magic hair anymore. And it all started because a barbarian king got really angry about a stolen vase and decided that smashing church property was an acceptable way to establish absolute political authority. Sometimes the most important moments in history begin with the pettiest possible disputes. The hollow crown of Dagobert, the last king who actually ruled the weight of gold and incompetence here standing in the royal palace at Paris in 629 CE. Watching 25-year-old King Dagobert, I paced back and forth like a caged lion, his magnificent hair flowing behind him as he contemplates the impossible task he's inherited, being the last Merovingian king who actually has to do the job of ruling. See, Dagobert has a problem that would make modern politicians weep with envy and terror in equal measure. He's inherited absolute power over the largest, richest, most politically complex kingdom in Europe, and everyone, nobles, bishops, warriors, peasants, foreign ambassadors, actually expects him to use that power competently. This might not seem like a crisis until you understand what had happened to the Merovingian dynasty in the 140 years since Clovis established the principle of divinely inherited royal authority. Successive kings had become increasingly convinced that their supernatural hair guaranteed successful rule regardless of their personal abilities. Why bother learning statecraft when God was personally ensuring your political success? Why study military strategy when divine blessing would deliver victory? Why master economics or law when heavenly authority made such mundane skills unnecessary? The result was 5 generations of increasingly incompetent kings who ruled successfully anyway, because the kingdom was wealthy enough and politically stable enough to function despite royal uselessness. Dagobert's predecessors had presided over an economic boom, territorial expansion, and cultural flowering that convinced everyone that the Merovingian system of hair-based divine kingship was the most effective form of government ever devised. But Dagobert, unlike his recent ancestors, was both intelligent enough to recognize that the kingdom's success had very little to do with royal competence and unlucky enough to inherit the throne just as that success was beginning to unravel. You see, the Frankish kingdom in 629 CE was facing its first serious existential crisis since Clovis's conquests. The economic boom was ending, territorial expansion had stalled, Powerful nobles were beginning to question royal authority, and foreign enemies were testing Frankish military strength for the first time in decades. Dagobert looked around his kingdom and realized something terrifying. He was the first Merovingian king in over a century who would actually need to govern effectively in order to keep the dynasty from collapsing entirely. The weight of this realization was literally crushing him. Dagobert spent his early years as king suffering from what medieval chroniclers described as melancholic humors, but what we'd probably recognize as a stress-induced mental breakdown. He was having panic attacks about political decisions, losing sleep over military strategy, and obsessing over economic policy in ways that would have seemed completely bizarre to his predecessors. But here's where the story gets interesting. Instead of succumbing to the pressure or retreating into the comfortable incompetence that had characterized recent Merovingian kings, Dagobert decided to become the most hands-on, micromanaging, obsessively involved ruler in European history. He started by doing something that hadn't been seen in the Frankish kingdom for generations, personally attending every major political meeting, military planning session, and judicial hearing in his realm. Previous kings had delegated such mundane tasks to their advisors while focusing on the ceremonial aspects of divine kingship. Dagobert insisted on making every important decision himself. His nobles were baffled. They'd grown accustomed to managing the kingdom while their kings provided supernatural legitimacy through strategic royal appearances. Suddenly, they had a king who wanted detailed reports on everything from tax collection to bridge repairs, who questioned their decisions, who demanded explanations for policies that had been operating on autopilot for decades. Dagobert's advisors tried to convince him that such intensive involvement in day-to-day governance was beneath the dignity of a divinely appointed monarch. Kings were supposed to embody God's authority through their sacred presence, not get bogged down in administrative details like some kind of glorified civil servant. Dagobert's response was essentially, if I'm going to be held responsible for this kingdom's success or failure, I'm going to personally control every aspect of how it's governed. He established what amounted to the first royal bureaucracy in European history, a system of royal agents who reported directly to the king on political, military, and economic conditions throughout the realm. Previous Merovingian kings had relied on traditional noble hierarchies to manage their territory. Dagobert created parallel administrative structures that bypassed traditional power networks and concentrated authority in royal hands. The innovation was brilliant, but it created a fundamental problem that would ultimately doom both Dagobert personally and the Merovingian system generally. You see, effective micromanagement requires extraordinary personal energy, detailed knowledge, and constant attention to political details. Dagobert possessed all these qualities, but they weren't inheritable. His system of intensive royal governance could only work as long as the king himself was willing and able to maintain exhausting levels of personal involvement in every aspect of government. What happened when the next king inherited Dagobert's centralized system but lacked his obsessive work ethic? What happened when royal authority had been concentrated so thoroughly in the person of a monarch that incompetent successors couldn't delegate effectively without undermining the entire basis of their legitimacy? Dagobert was creating the most effective system of royal government in European history, but he was also ensuring that his less capable successors would face an impossible choice: either match his extraordinary personal commitment to governing or watch the entire kingdom collapse under the weight of centralized authority that no one else was equipped to exercise. By 635 CE, Dagobert had transformed the Frankish kingdom into a political machine that ran with unprecedented efficiency, as long as he personally maintained every component. He was simultaneously the most successful Merovingian king since Clovis, and the creator of conditions that would make effective Merovingian kingship impossible for his heirs. But Dagobert had one more innovation up his royal sleeve, and it would prove to be the most consequential political experiment of his reign. The bureaucracy that ate the kingdom 6 years into Dagobert's reign. You're sitting in the newly constructed Royal Administrative Complex in Paris, surrounded by the most elaborate governmental bureaucracy Western Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. Scribes are copying legal documents, tax assessors are calculating revenues, military planners are updating strategic maps, and diplomatic correspondents are managing relationships with kingdoms from Spain to Constantinople. And overseeing all of this frantic activity is King Dagobert himself, whose magnificent hair is now showing premature gray streaks from the stress of personally managing the most complex political system in the medieval world. But here's the thing that's really fascinating about Dagobert's bureaucratic revolution. He didn't set out to create a governmental system that would eventually destroy royal authority. He was trying to solve what seemed like a straightforward problem of political efficiency. The Frankish kingdom had grown too large and too complex for traditional methods of noble-based governance to handle effectively. Previous Merovingian kings had managed their territory through a feudal system where local nobles controlled their regions with minimal royal supervision. This worked fine when the kingdom was smaller and political challenges were simpler. But by Dagobert's time, the Frankish realm included dozens of different ethnic groups, multiple languages, competing legal traditions, and economic systems that range from primitive barter to sophisticated international trade. The old system of delegating authority to local nobles was producing increasingly chaotic results. Different regions were implementing contradictory policies. Legal disputes were being resolved according to incompatible traditions. Tax collection was wildly inconsistent, and military coordination was nearly impossible because local commanders answered to their regional nobles rather than to central royal authority. Dagobert's solution was elegantly simple. Replace the traditional noble hierarchy with a professional administrative class that answered directly to the king. He recruited educated men, many of them drawn from church schools or the remnants of Roman administrative families, and trained them in what amounted to the first civil service system in post-Roman Europe. These royal agents were given standardized legal codes, uniform procedures for tax collection, coordinated military protocols, and direct communication channels to the royal court. The system worked brilliantly. For the first time in Merovingian history, the kingdom was being governed according to consistent policies implemented by administrators who were accountable to central authority rather than to local power networks. Tax revenues increased dramatically because collection was standardized and supervised. Legal disputes were resolved more quickly and fairly because judges were applying uniform codes rather than competing traditions. Military campaigns became more effective because commanders were coordinating their strategies through central planning rather than making independent decisions based on local interests. Within just a few years, Dagobert's bureaucratic reforms had transformed the Frankish kingdom from a loose confederation of semi-autonomous regions into something approaching a modern centralized state. But there was one crucial flaw in Dagobert's design, and it would prove fatal to the entire Merovingian system. You see, Dagobert's bureaucracy was designed around the assumption that future kings would be as competent and hardworking as he was. The entire system required constant royal supervision, detailed royal decision-making, and intensive royal involvement in administrative details. It could only function effectively with a king who was willing to spend 12-hour days managing governmental minutiae. Moreover, Dagobert's reforms had systematically undermined traditional sources of political authority that might have compensated for royal incompetence. By replacing noble-based governance with royal bureaucracy, he had eliminated the network of local leaders who had previously been able to manage regional affairs independently of central oversight. The old system had been inefficient, but it had been resilient. If a Merovingian king was useless, local nobles could continue governing their territories according to established traditions while providing ceremonial deference to royal authority. The kingdom could function despite royal incompetence because political power was distributed across multiple power centers. Dagobert's new system was efficient, but it was fragile. If a king couldn't personally manage the bureaucracy, there was no fallback mechanism for maintaining governmental authority. Political power had been so thoroughly centralized that royal incompetence would paralyze the entire kingdom. And here's where the story gets really tragic. Dagobert knew this was a problem, but he couldn't figure out how to solve it. By 638 CE, Dagobert was literally working himself to death, trying to maintain personal oversight of every aspect of his governmental system. He was suffering from what medieval chroniclers described as exhaustion of the vital humors, but what we'd recognize as the physical and psychological effects of severe burnout. Dagobert realized that his system required modifications that would allow effective governance to continue even if future kings lacked his extraordinary personal commitment to administrative detail. But every modification he considered seemed to undermine either royal authority or governmental efficiency. If he delegated significant authority back to regional nobles, he'd be recreating the problems of inconsistent governance that had motivated his reforms in the first place. If he created independent administrative institutions that could function without direct royal supervision, he'd be establishing power centers that could eventually challenge royal supremacy. Dagobert spent his final years trying to thread this needle, creating a system that would be both efficient and resilient, both centralized and sustainable. He experimented with different administrative structures, tried various methods of royal delegation, and attempted to train his heir in the complexities of bureaucratic management. But ultimately, he ran out of time. Dagobert died in 639 CE at the age of 35, probably from stress-related health problems, leaving behind the most sophisticated governmental system in Europe and a son who had neither the ability nor the inclination to maintain it. What happened next was the most predictable political disaster in medieval history. The magnificent failure you're now witnessing, the coronation of Clovis II in 639 CE, and what you're seeing is the beginning of the end of effective Merovingian government. The new king, barely 16 years old, possesses the magnificent hair that symbolizes his divine right to rule over the most complex political system in Europe. There's just one small problem. He has absolutely no idea how any of it works. Young Clovis II stands before the assembled nobles, bishops, and administrators who had served his father, and you can practically see the moment when everyone realizes that the Merovingian dynasty has produced its first truly incompetent king, since the system became too complex for incompetent kings to manage. Dagobert had died knowing this day would come, and he'd spent months trying to prepare his son for the impossible task he was inheriting. But preparing someone to manage a sophisticated bureaucracy is like trying to teach surgery through correspondence courses. No amount of theoretical instruction can substitute for practical experience and natural aptitude. Clovis II possessed neither. The transition was catastrophic. Within weeks of his coronation, the royal bureaucracy that had functioned like a precision timepiece under Dagobert began experiencing systematic breakdowns. Administrative decisions that required royal approval were delayed for months because Clovis couldn't understand the issues involved. Tax collection became inconsistent because he couldn't grasp the complexities of revenue systems his father had implemented. Military coordination suffered because he was incapable of following strategic discussions, much less making tactical decisions. But here's where the story becomes really interesting. Instead of recognizing his limitations and attempting to delegate authority to competent advisors, Clovis II tried to maintain the appearance of personal royal control over governmental systems he didn't understand. This wasn't just royal vanity, it was structural necessity. Dagobert's bureaucratic reforms had been explicitly designed around the principle of direct royal authority. The entire system's legitimacy depended on the fiction that the king was personally making informed decisions about every aspect of governance. If Clovis admitted that he couldn't manage the complexities his father had mastered, he'd be admitting that the system itself was flawed. So instead of delegating, Clovis began what can only be described as governmental improvisation. He made administrative decisions based on incomplete understanding of the issues involved. He approved policies without grasping their implications. He issued contradictory orders because he couldn't remember what he decided about similar problems in the past. The results were exactly what you'd expect. The most sophisticated political system in Europe began eating itself from the inside out. Regional administrators, receiving incomprehensible or contradictory instructions from the royal court, began making independent decisions about how to interpret royal policy. Tax collectors, given unclear guidelines about revenue assessment, started improvising collection methods that varied wildly from region to region. Military commanders, unable to get coherent strategic direction from central authority, began coordinating their campaigns through informal networks that bypassed royal oversight entirely. Within just a few years, Dagobert's centralized bureaucracy had devolved into something worse than the old system of noble-based governance it had been designed to replace. At least the traditional feudal system had been explicitly decentralized. Everyone understood that regional nobles were supposed to manage their territories independently. Clovis II's system maintained the fiction of royal control while providing none of the actual coordination that justified centralization. But the really tragic part of this story is that there were people in Clovis II's court who could have managed the governmental systems effectively, if they'd been allowed to do so. The royal bureaucracy that Dagobert had created was staffed with competent, experienced administrators who understood how the various governmental systems were supposed to function. These men, later known as the mayors of the palace, possessed all the practical skills necessary for effective governance. They just lacked the divine hair that Merovingian political theory required for legitimate royal authority. So you had a situation where the person with supernatural legitimacy couldn't govern effectively, while the people who could govern effectively lacked supernatural legitimacy. And the system Dagobert had created was too rigid to allow for the kind of practical delegation that might have resolved this contradiction. The mayors of the palace, particularly a brilliant administrator named Grimold, began gradually assuming more responsibility for day-to-day governance, while maintaining the ceremonial fiction that Clovis II was making all-important decisions. It was the medieval equivalent of a parliamentary system, except that Parliament had to pretend the constitutional monarch was actually running the government. This arrangement worked for a while, but it created the fundamental contradiction that would eventually destroy the Merovingian dynasty. The people doing the work of governing weren't getting credit for successful policies, while the person getting credit for successful policies wasn't actually doing any governing. By the time Clovis II died in 657 CE, the Frankish kingdom was being effectively ruled by competent administrators who officially didn't exist, while being ceremonially headed by an incompetent king whose only qualification for office was his genetically superior hair. Dagobert's dream of creating a sustainable system of effective royal government had become a nightmare of bureaucratic dysfunction held together only by collective agreement to ignore obvious reality. And this was just the beginning. Clovis II's successors would be even less competent, the governmental crises would become even more severe, and the gap between ceremonial authority and practical power would continue widening until it became impossible to maintain even the fiction of Merovingian rule. Dagobert had been the last Merovingian king who actually ruled his kingdom. Everyone who came after him would simply wear the crown, while other people did the work of kingship. The age of the do-nothing kings had begun, and it would continue until Pepin the Short finally decided that if he was going to do all the work of governing, he might as well get the official title that went with it. The hollow crown of Dagobert had become a perfect metaphor for what the Merovingian dynasty had become. Beautiful, traditional, symbolically important, and completely empty of actual substance.